Welcome to Inaudible. I'm your host, Jeremy Weiland. On this podcast, we discuss the weird, beautiful channeled messages found in the long tradition of contact with the Confederation of planets in service to the one infinite creator. These messages articulate a philosophy of spiritual evolution, popularly known as the Law of One. Many of these messages are available to listen to on our sister podcast, Living Love and Light, available on all platforms. We seek to provide analysis and commentary of this philosophy described in these messages, identifying the common themes and grappling with the application of this information to our human lives. However, we are not counselors, gurus, or experts of any kind, so please evaluate our words in light of our shortcomings and use your own best judgment. Thanks for listening. Welcome to Inaudible. I am kicking this off solo because I did an interview with Dr. Stephen Tyman, a fellow founding member of the Other Selves Working Group, earlier this week. And so we didn't do our regular introduction, so I just wanted to throw something in there. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a long-running philosophical concept called the problem of evil that has been considered ever since the time of Plato. And we're talking about how that relates to polarity in the Law of One philosophy, how nuanced an issue evil and service to self actually is, and some of the consequences and implications of that for how we do our service and how we think about the loyal opposition. So with no further ado, let's get into that. All right. So we have Stephen Tyman here to talk to us about the Law of One and the problem of evil. Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Jeremy.
Great. So I think a good place to start, especially for those of us who are not familiar with philosophy, is what is this problem of evil in philosophy? What are its implications? And how should we think about it in like the history of thought here as we, approach fourth density, perhaps?
Well, if you take the problem of evil in its traditional forms, it has most bedeviled those philosophies that have a theological basis to them. Now, that's not universally true because going back all the way to Plato, who would have preceded theology as we know it, that is, the theologies based on the book, which would be Christian, Jewish, and Islamic versions. Plato could not understand how one could deliberately choose evil. And so the only solution Plato could come up with was the notion that somebody who did choose evil was in fact choosing what they thought was good. So it was a mistake, in effect, on their part. They were choosing what was perhaps approximate good or a lesser good, thinking that was higher than the true good or the higher good. And so, for example, if you are aware of dietary requirements and nevertheless choose to violate those, there has to be some kind of motive for doing so, and it's based on the fact that you have a sweet tooth or something of that nature, and you momentarily give in to a lesser evil. A lesser good, and set that over and above the greater good. Now, for example, if you're angry at somebody and you lash out at them, you're yielding to a lesser impulse, whereas when cooler heads would have prevailed, you would have known better than to do that. So Plato's view concerning the nature of evil came to be called the privative notion of evil. And when you project that onto a view of how the universe works, it's thought that the best way to think of evil is good turned down to the lowest possible volume, if you will. And as we gain more experience, as we become smarter, we learn to choose the greater good over the lesser good. So it's simply an issue of maturation, if you will, or getting more and more intelligent. So intelligence then was really from a very early date in the Western tradition allied with the notion of good, which means that there was a univocal concept of value, the good lying at the highest, and the lesser good lying at the lowest, and that as we become more advanced, as we become smarter, as we become more mature, we move up that scale. What wouldn't register for somebody like Plato is that somebody could say, as within the Christian tradition, for example, you sometimes hear mentioned, evil be thou my good. So what cannot be understood within that frame of reference is how one could deliberately choose evil. That would change the whole picture if that were possible. Now that gets carried over into the theological framework once you introduce the notion of God in a little bit different way, but that same motif is preserved. For example, if you have a conception of God, which has traditionally been called the God of perfection, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all good. How could such a God make a creation in which evil is possible? Once again, absolute evil would be unthinkable in that context. And you have to introduce a notion whereby you have selves, creatures, that would be us, that are on a learning curve and making choices, thinking of these choices as being good, only to learn later that in reality they were lesser goods. So that fits in with the Platonic response, but that response is made more uh, critical when the notion of the perfect God is at stake now, because the perfect God cannot have created a creation in which creatures would have a fundamental choice of evil based on the structure of creation itself. So that became then the motive for speaking in monotheisms of evil as a mere privation. Now, the interesting thing about these monotheisms is that what I've just outlined is the metaphysical or the ontological dimension of those monotheisms, which is typically called theology. But alongside that, in all three, you have kind of mythopoetic conceptions of evil, which often involve things like the devil whispering in your ear, so that you have now the notion of an angel or fallen angel or an exalted being of some sort that is able to choose evil not on the basis of being less intelligent, but upon some other basis altogether. Now, the basis that emerged as an explanation for that sort of thing suggested that there was a dimension other than intelligence involved in the process of human choice, and that dimension would be will. So what one can be within that framework, one could be perfectly intelligent. Satan has never been accused of being anything but intelligent. You can be perfectly intelligent and yet have a will directed towards the dark side rather than the light side. And it is sometimes expressed by saying that Satan would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. So that you could see that as a kind of halting, lisping after the more precise formulation that Ra gives, when Ra describes the choice that we here in third density face between service to self and service to others. So that that path, which is traditionally been called the path of evil, would be that path in which the self is not prepared to sacrifice its own sense of self-interest for the sake of serving others, but rather clings devotedly to that self-interest as the highest value. So within that framework, it seems that, at least from the standpoint of third density experience, such as we enjoy now, the choice involves a real split in value. One can actually function in a spiritual way while making the choice of service to self. So that means that it becomes a viable choice. It becomes a choice grounded in the way things actually are. And indeed, it turns out, according to what we have from the Confederation, that there are those individuated souls who have made it through third density and been harvested to fourth and to fifth and to sixth densities over the course of long eons, while remaining on the path of service to self. So that suggests that the whole structure of the densities, at least, are arranged such that such a choice is viable and allows for development and growth along a trajectory, along a path for a great many eons. So somehow you have to think reality then as being conducive to that possibility. And if we take the opposite possibility as real as well, as grounded in the nature of reality as well, then it would seem like you have two fundamental options, which any description of the nature of reality as we experience it would have to accommodate it. Now, once again, there were earlier attempts to do just that in, for example, Manichaeanism. If you posit an eternally good God and an eternally evil God as eternally in opposition to each other, that at least helps to explain the possibility of these choices persisting for a great length of time. Now, in point of fact, however, Ra is actually a monist. And so Ra rejects that point of view. And as part and parcel of that rejection, Ra also suggests that to the best of their knowledge, no entity has been able to make it past the middle part of sixth density on the negative path without releasing the potential involved in what Ra has denominated service to self. So that means that to some extent you'd have to say that Ra agrees with the Platonic tradition and the traditions of the book, in which they say that evil itself is not grounded in any nature of what is. But that gives rise to another question. That is, how can there be within the creation a significant function ordered to that which is not? And if you think of the creation as something which is cut and dried, something which comes from the Creator full blown, and merely is a backdrop for human aspiration or development, that's not going to work. So the only way that you can conceive the two things together is to say that creation itself is protean, and that is in fact as protean or something which is in a process of development, which is in fact what Ra will say. The creation is a protean entity, and that corresponds to certain attempts made by philosophers which call themselves process philosophers to think through the problem of evil as having some kind of a ground, even if this ground is at the same time an abyss. That's how Schelling put the matter when he tried to think this through. He called it the not the ground, but the Abgrund, the abyss.
I'm particularly struck by the historical process that you've related here, because it's, if I understood you correctly, Steve, it seems like back in Plato's time, was there not a notion of evil from in his philosophy? It was simply the absence of good. Like, is this what you mean by the development over time from Plato's time of there being some kind of ground to the negative or service to self evil concept?
Well, once again, we come back to this distressing split between the emotive, mythological dimensions of a culture and the rational dimensions of a culture. And at the time that Plato came along, Greek philosophy was developing along a trajectory of rationality. It was really the sort of defining upsurge of the rational moment in the Western tradition. That's in fact why the Western tradition is typically traced to Greece, precisely because there was this moment in which the pre-Socratic philosophers such as Heraclitus and Thales uh, uh, and others, and then Socrates, and then Plato, and then Aristotle. That was a big upsurge in this moment of rational flowering. Um, uh, we could have traced our heritage back to Egypt, for example.
Right.
And in Egypt, there were what we would call magicians at work. The priestcraft was known for its kind of theurgic work, in which some were dark magicians and some were considered to be magicians of the light, and of course the dividing line between those two often became blurred. But they were working with powers which they often understood to be forbidden. And so the Greeks were definitely aware of the Egyptians. And there's a sense in which one has to assume that this upsurge into the rational moment that the Greeks were invested in were in some measure a deliberate effort to move away from that kind of cultural matrix into the sunshine, so to speak. And the sunshine was defined as that which could be rationally shared among all human beings and didn't require delving into these darker forces that could now be seen to be not entirely wholesome.
That's really interesting. Are you, if I don't mean to be reductive, but are you suggesting that a lot of what Greek philosophy actually entails is a kind of rationalization of Egyptian
Well, no,
practices?
it's a moving into rationality, which is
Okay.
not the same as a
Oh,
rationalization.
I know. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's making it more rational and less
it's
rationality as opposed to occultism, right?
yes.
Okay, that's what I meant.
There were occult practitioners even in Greece, as you know. I mean, there were those, for example, who uh, consulted the Delphic oracle
Right.
and so on and so forth. And so those things were definitely known. And in fact, when Nietzsche came along, many centuries later, one of the things which Nietzsche tried to do was to undo what had then become the standard interpretation of Greek culture as this very reason-based uh, efflorescence, and to suggest that there was a dark side
Mm-hmm.
to Greek culture, and that was discoverable within Greek tragedy, for example. Uh, so,
That's
and that
interesting.
it entailed this kind of autochthonous sense, and so the movement to the rational was in that reading uh, a movement, deliberately a movement away from these darker dimensions. So it was a kind of overlay of the rational upon these darker forces, which Nietzsche was trying to bring out at that moment.
Yeah, this complexifies my sort of very simplistic way of approaching how the whole idea of a chosen negativity, what we call service to self, uh, becomes thinkable in our culture, because a lot of the way that I looked at it was in the Greeks were all about moderation, right? The idea was not to be all this way or all that way, but to hew for the middle.
And
And then,
that's what arose through Greek rationality. That's right.
yeah, but it's interesting to contemplate the idea that even in that moderation, it casts a shadow itself. Like that there's this polarity that continually arises to the point where you get in Christianity, suddenly moderation is not what you want. What you want is to always be good and to never be evil, right? You always hew to one God, and anything not doing that is wrong. It seemed to me like there was a change that was made when Christianity came onto the scene, and maybe I'm misreading it.
Well, I think you're right. I think maybe I would add one more consideration to that equation, and that would be repression.
Mm,
It's not that moderation was a balancing between good and evil, but it was a, uh, uh, a a moderated approach to appetite.
yeah,
Not too much, not too little, right? And so uh, it was it was appetite which was the issue, or you could say desire, which was what was in need of moderation. And it was a mark of maturity that you were able to moderate your appetites.
right.
But now, uh, what happened when you introduced this notion of the all-embracing God? And not only that, but here's an interesting point. an all-embracing God that issues commandments. Now that's key.
Mm-hmm.
That issues commandments. That the situation begins to change because it's no longer a question of what would really be best for myself in the long run. Uh, how how would I best address myself to my own appetites in the long run? Is it best for me to swing wildly from pillar to post, or do I do better to uh, cultivate a set of habits which are moderate and which give me a more balanced life, uh, taken as a whole? That's what the Greeks came up with. But now, if if there are certain appetites which themselves are prohibited, uh, that that invites repression. And take, for example, the life of the monk who has taken a vow of chastity, but nevertheless has these disturbing urges. Uh, you must now come up with a way to address these urges. And there's no successful way to address those urges within the value framework that you've now adopted, given the prohibitions you're trying to live by, other than repressing them. So repression then becomes a a serious portion of the psychic life of these avid Christians. And a funny thing happens on the way to repression. There's something more and more delicious about that which is repressed. And so you're actually empowering that uh, desire by blocking it and forcing it underground, so to speak. And now there comes to be this whole portion of the psyche that is a repository of repressed desire. And and that exercises an allure that can be associated with the allure of evil itself. So now, evil as an act of uh, violation of law uh, becomes uh, so, more emphasized as an experience typical of the spiritual aspirant. The more pure you seek to get in your desires, the more uh, tendency there is to repress those desires that you don't approve of. And there's a siren call from down below then, as these desires take many different forms and call out for expression that is not allowed. And it's interesting that when you read the Law of One, you see that the Ten Commandments that you find in the Old Testament, Law says, were not given by the positive entity originally called Yahweh, but by the negative entity mocking or pretending to be the Yahweh. So, what sets up a structure of repression actually empowers the potential of evil in an oblique way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't even thought of repression, but I did have a note here that it seemed to me like that what happened with Christianity was like it was as if the self is to be a moderate individual finding balance within. And in it seemed like in a lot of in Greek culture, it was in the marketplace, in the society, that whatever might be called good or evil was worked out. With Christianity, everything gets brought within. And now it's this contest within the self about Do I allow this? Do I allow that? I have to keep myself rigid and disciplined. And repression, like, that's a way better way of saying it.
And I would point out further that you find similar things throughout the Judaic tradition and the Islamic tradition, all these religions of the book,
Yeah.
which all base themselves on the Old Testament in some way or another.
Yeah. So
And so
it's
that
this.
becomes. Go ahead.
I'm just trying to figure out where to go next with this. So we have this idea that a possibility begins to emerge that what we would call evil, service to self, negativity, can be consciously willed and chosen. And it brings up this problem of what the ground of that experience is, what the ground of those values are. Am I connecting back up with where we left off?
I think so. And
Okay.
the uh, if we allow ourselves to project this problem forward and ask what evil looks like writ large on a macroscopic scale, it's clearly uh, associated with authoritarian, dominant structures of government. Now, such structures of government involve an elite that have managed to risen to power such that they have dominion over others. And the self then undergoes this inflation. The sense of self undergoes this fantastic inflation so that it involves me not just having control over myself, but over vast numbers of others. And I can direct their activities in ways that appeal to me. Now, as Rob points out, that individuals that are within this configuration can very often regard themselves as good
Mm-hmm.
because what they think they're doing is putting the universe in order or putting their society in order or putting the uh, immediate domain in which they live in order. Sometimes it's only the family. But it represents an urge to have control, an urge to have my will become manifest as an ordering factor in the world in which I live.
It seems to me that gets perilously close to this idea of evil as like a choice that's made out of a lack of intelligence, right? Because you're kind of you're misanalyzing what's going on in your decision making. But I think what you're talking about, and I was really fascinated by this idea of an evolution of evil coming out of repressed desires that are then that then become to be valued in spite of the self, right? Like, and
Well,
then there's a
it's true, but
connection between that.
if you look at authoritarian governments, they are repressive. So, in other words, if you are lower down on the pecking order in an authoritarian system, there's a great deal of your own propensities for self expression that you have to repress
Right.
for purposes of making your way up that pecking order. And you can see that at work in American politics today. You can see that work all over the world, and in those countries especially that have become authoritarian.
Yeah.
So, in other words, the way you curry favor within the power elite is by playing according to their rules, even if those rules are not something you would have promulgated. So you play according to those rules up until the point where you have enough power so that it's you that is dictating the rules.
Yeah. And then
And that's the way.
the question is what comes after that, right? What happens after you get what you want? And like,
Well, it seems that it's pretty insatiable.
Yeah, exactly. Then
that
you find something else.
if Putin gets Ukraine, there's no stopping point. He's going to have to keep going because there's nothing else to do. There's no further growth
Yeah.
Possible on that trajectory. And so you have to just keep expanding and expanding and expanding. And at some point, and this is presumably well beyond third density, at some point, uh, as Raw puts it, uh, an entity evolving along the path of service to self loses all interest in other selves altogether, because it's the service to self becomes so compacted within itself that it no longer even can see its own advantage being expressed in any domain of manifestation. And so
Which is
that has to happen just prior, I would think, just prior to the great moment of realization that there's no way forward
yeah.
on that path.
Which must be particularly painful, because if we hold to this theory that a lot of these negative habits of conceiving of the self and of the other arise from repression, then what you have as you sort of retreat within, I would think, Steve, is a very abused and painful inside, right? Like your self-conception has almost been sort of um, abused for the purpose of pursuing power without. It's been disciplined and rigidified, turned against itself, like what those of Ra say about, I believe, Himmler. What is the first separation? Self from self. There has to be a pain that arises from that would be difficult to reconcile with. When I saw the whole, what you were saying about Putin constantly expanding, there was a sense in which that made a lot of sense to me on an intuitive level, because if you've made your life about the acquisition and deployment of power, then you're always going to want to look outwards,
Yeah,
constantly projecting outwards to be more of a self than you are. You never want to turn in for any reason other than to, well, to use the metaphor, to knock to knock the people at home around, right? To get the metropole in line so that you can go out into the frontier, right?
yeah. I think that self-examination just becomes something that has no interest to you whatsoever. So I don't know if I think what happens is that at some point the capacity for uh, uh, self-control it abandons the notion of repressing desire and flips that uh, dynamic on its head, so that
Yeah.
you're what you're attempting to do is to repress the desire of others. So the service to self becomes necessarily other oriented, because the power that you seek to exert has to be over others.
Right.
And at that point, you don't really have the dynamic that we typically recognize as repression at all. It's all outer directed. So, for example, when I look at Donald Trump, I don't see any effort to repress at all. In fact, he's kind of irrepressible. There's nothing left of that internalized structure. It's all been externalized, and so there's the I don't even think he's capable of repressing himself, which is precisely what makes him so effective, because he's not inhibited in expressing things that most of the rest of us would be very reluctant to say.
Yeah.
That uninhibited quality gives him a great deal of power, but it's power that needs to be reflected back to itself
Right.
constantly. So it's got this insatiable hunger.
It has to see the effect it's having on the world on a regular basis to reaffirm its own existence and its own consequentiality.
So that may well be, as you say, grounded in some kind of primordial pain. But it's a pain that the self refuses to feel.
It maybe just projects out, like it
It's all
weaponizes
projection
it.
all the time.
Yeah, it just weaponizes it. Yeah, that's really interesting. There isn't a lot of like in the conversations that I have seen and participated in around the law of one. There really isn't a lot of detailed exploration of the negative psychology or like what their whole reward model is, right? Like what kind of drives them forward. And it's not because there's a lack of curiosity about this. In fact, if you look at the forums where people post about law of one discussions and stuff like that, it's almost a cliche now that there will be the perennial like, well, what about the STS people? I'm an STS person. I'm looking for service to self information. Don't I belong here? And like the paralyzing effect that has on everybody because they don't know what they would even make of that, right? Let alone how to relate to it. Like, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to just say, hey, we respect your polarity, but we're trying to concentrate our polarity over here. But just the inability first of all, I don't think anybody who's advertising themselves as service to self is usually service to self. That's not, that kind of openness is not usually good for manipulating people, right?
That's right. Yeah. That's the first thing to notice. I mean, it's a bit of a confession against interest.
Right.
But what it suggests is that, they're pretty new to the game.
Yeah.
And they do notice that there are selfish impulses within their own psyche. Well, welcome to the human race. I mean,
right.
That's going to be true of everyone. And, it's that's why the percentage it takes of service to others versus service to self on the positive path is much lower than what it is on the negative path. That is to say, Ross says that it takes 50% service to others to get over the hump to harvestability. Whereas if you're on the negative path, it takes 95% service to self. And that there's essentially an equivalence between those two numbers. So one is going to find impulses to selfishness.
Yeah.
Even if one is very high on the scale of service to others. And one always has to be fastidious because it's very easy to deceive oneself, to suggest that one is actually acting for the benefit of another, whereas in some secret sense that turns out to be, at least in a strong proportion, service to oneself.
Yeah.
For example, if I have a child and I want that child to do well, and I could go to great lengths, I could devote myself to creating the circumstances which will permit that child to do well. But perhaps hidden from me, there is the dimension of the fact that I want to be seen as a person whose child does well. So is it really the child that I am acting for the benefit of, or is the child I'm acting for the benefit of a projection of myself, and it's really myself that I'm addressing? So that tricky questions like that constantly come up on the service to others path.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of what makes service to self decisions have that character because it is very mixed, right? It can look from multiple different perspectives. It can look positive or negative sometimes, a given human decision, um, a given interested action. But I would say, like in the wash, generally speaking, it seems like negative folks tend to really be attached to outcomes. And that's a huge part of how they direct their thinking. Whereas positive folks tend to be more about principles, intentions. Uh, do you agree with that?
Up to a point,
Okay.
I think that uh, when uh, negative entities uh, begin to approach harvestability, they become more aware of centrality of intentions there as well.
Mm.
Uh, uh, that could lead us into another interesting point about the conception of evil that we often have. We often associate evil with these horrible deeds. So the serial killer, the rapist, these are classic examples that give rise to the notion of unadulterated evil. How could somebody do that?
Yeah.
And uh, when you step back from behaviors such as killing other individuals just but for the sake of seeing them die, or for the sake of experiencing that power you have over them for that fleeting moment, um, it it doesn't really go to a more penetrating or more long-term benefit to that particular self. So it becomes a repetitive behavior, and you're stuck in that repetitive behavior, and you develop an appetite for it, perhaps, and you get stuck there. But that doesn't mean you're anywhere near harvestability. And so when you really begin to contemplate what a more harvestable individual on the negative path would be, uh, very likely they would be able to blend almost seamlessly with a broader society in which there are a great many service to others individuals. And so you wouldn't single them out. And if you look at our political system, you can find all kinds of people that are really strongly self-interested and are able to come up with rhetorical tropes that uh, suggest to others that they're really trying to act in their best interest, in the public interest, uh, and you have to look rather closely to see that okay, they're really self-interested. Now, such individuals as that might well have a history that at some point required them to be able to kill off those soft feelings of compassion for others. And so who knows, they may have had past incarnations in which they learned to do just that. Maybe they were murderers. Maybe they were ruthless in one fashion or another. Uh, and so the long and the short of that seems to me that to be that uh, there is an intensification of intention that necessarily follows either path, either service to others or service to self, and that uh, the factor of intelligence does come into play. I can hardly imagine a thoroughly unintelligent service to self person being anywhere near harvestable, because they have to be astute enough to know where their self-interest lies. And since their self-interest is so invested in, in achieving consequences which augment their effectiveness in a manifest domain in the world, they have to know how to manipulate other people and achieve positions for that power to be realizable. And that's just not something less intelligent people can pull off. Now, on the other side, one knows perhaps examples of people who maybe don't strike one as being astonishingly intelligent, but who are nevertheless very giving. And in dealing with that sort of situation, one wants to introduce such factors as emotional intelligence, such that it can play into the compassion which one feels permeating one's whole being. There also can be extremely intelligent people that are very compassionate, but the kind of shrewdness that is characteristic of the service to self path can often be missing there.
Yeah, I think there actually is a kind of intelligence that's very David Graeber talks about it. It's I forget the word for it, but it's like being really good at putting yourself in somebody else's shoes is not necessarily something that dumb people can do, right? Like to be able to really see from somebody else's eyes and put yourself in their shoes and take that. He called it imaginative labor because he said it's a form of labor that servants have to do for their masters to anticipate their demands, right? And so you're constantly putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. But if you see that as a kind of service to others kind of thing, you're putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. That takes a lot of like ingenuity and imagination to
It
contemplate
does,
how
but
that
I
might
would
be.
point out that particular motif can cut both ways, because you put that in a master slave context, and indeed, if you're progressing upon a negative path, one of the things that you're going to have to do is kowtow to those in authority. And one of the ways you go about doing that is trying to figure out what it is they want
That's a good
and
point.
find a way to appeal to that. But I think there's something in what you're saying, because uh, that's not really putting yourself in their shoes, uh, because uh, there's a certain sense in which, at this emotional level, which the compassionate uh, occupy, there's nobody in those shoes on the negative path.
Right. They're just
And
objects to
so,
be moved around on the board. Yeah.
yeah,
So
uh,
you're
it,
it's more like trying to predict an animal's behavior. It's like, oh,
right.
what is it going to do? Sorry.
Speaking of which, I have to let the dog in. I'll be
Oh,
right
go
back.
for it. Yep.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem. I just been trying to think about where we left off. Uh we were talking about you were talking about how emotional intelligence I was talking about can cut both
Yeah,
ways. Um
and the fact that within people who are compassionate, um, there that plays out differently. So, in other words, when one's able to put oneself in somebody else's shoes, uh, uh, you you are allowing their structure of feeling to kind of permeate your own. There's a certain sense in which one can never do that completely. And so one's always having to make a surmise, an analogy based on one's own experience. How would I feel if I were in that position? But one gets feedback, and it's by developing a capacity to respond to that feedback that one develops an effective compassion-based means of interacting with another individual. And the single requirement for that is humility, because one's constantly having to realize that other people don't necessarily function in exactly the same way that I do. And so if I am genuinely to serve this other individual, I have to keep the portals of learning constantly open and realize that any conclusions I might be drawing or any efforts I might be making could well be misconceived.
Yeah.
So there's that. And then additionally, there's the factor that sometimes what people actually want is not what they really need.
Mm-hmm.
And it sometimes happens that one has a better informed sense of what they might actually be calling for than they do at a particular time. For example, this is quite frequently the case when dealing with children.
Yeah.
But it's also the case in dealing with one's peers sometimes. And so then we don't have, if it's a peer-based relationship, we don't have the right to unilaterally conclude what would be good for them. But on the other hand, it's not just a question of always pleasing them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the difficult work that happens not just in green ray, but also in blue ray comes into play, because one has to be honest with them.
Yeah.
And that honest feedback can often throw them off their game. And they can even turn on you. This happens really quite frequently. People will turn on you when you give them honest feedback. And sometimes the better part of humility is simply allowing that to happen and then seeing what comes of it. It might be
What is that?
street sweeper or something like that.
All right. Well, I guess we'll have to exercise some humility and patience here.
Okay. It can often be the case that what people really need from you is something so that's so intensive as catalyst that they will never come back to you again. And you have to accept that as a possibility.
Yeah. There's also the possibility of just choosing not to give them what they want. Like, that's also a form of service, to withhold it.
Yeah.
But the way that I usually think about it that helps me understand it in a really polarized way is that the negative entity is trying to control other people. Their decisions are grounded in making other selves in the world safe for themselves, right? Whereas positive folks, whatever they're doing, whether it's withholding service, giving service, doing it in a way where maybe they won't be talk to them again, all those possibilities that you related and more, they're trying to free that other self to be their best self. Now that can be misinterpreted. The actions you take to do that may be mistaken, it turns out. But if that goal is for them to be the most themselves, the most the creator, then that is a positive intention. And it's why hewing to the intention specifically, rather than, making it about whether or not you actually got the outcome you want. That's
right.
where I was going with the negative being outcome oriented, because it's all about this externalized self that they're manipulating into place. Whereas for the positive person, it seems like it's about stepping out of the way of this greater self coming into being through other selves, right?
That's right. What complicates that issue, of course, is that there are often mutual projects which service to others individuals are engaged in.
Mm-hmm.
And in those cases, you can't simply pull back from altogether from the outcome, because it's an outcome-based enterprise that you're involved with on a cooperative basis. So it's a very tricky balancing act. It gets very complex
Right, because you don't want to value the outcome more than the person, right?
You don't want, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that the outcome involves many people, and on a particular occasion, you're only dealing with one or two or three, whatever, and it may be that the particular individuals that you're approximately relating to have certain sets of requirements, whereas the many others that you're also trying to serve have requirements that, to the best of your ability to see, are not consonant with those which the individuals that you're proximately dealing with have going. And so it becomes very complicated. Sometimes there's no, to my experience, there's no option but to withdraw. For you can't, you're just not in a position where you can give these people what they want, and at the same time maintain the relationship that you feel you need to a broader community. And that happens not infrequently.
Yeah, I'm picking up. It's not just a matter of calculation. It's not like a utilitarian calculation. Like, we can't think of it in those terms most of the time.
Yeah, you can't put it in numbers.
Yeah,
and so a lot of the time you're flying by the seat of your pants. It's got to be instinct.
Yeah.
It's I mean, if it's a question of serving a broader community versus serving, a few individuals, when you just look at it that way, the answer comes almost immediately. But what if serving this broader community cannot be effectuated except through the offices of the smaller community that you somehow feel are distorted? How does that play out?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's there's not an answer, an a priori answer. It's something that has to be explored experientially, and can be very, very confusing.
And it may be, like I think you said earlier, there is no necessarily correct outcome. The entire functional value of the experience is in the contemplation, is in the inquiry into the self that is required in order to make the ethical choice, even if it's the wrong one.
That's right. I mean, that's the way service to others plays out at the level of the self.
Yeah.
But also, service to others is intended as a service to others, which confounds the whole situation, because one never really has enough information to make a definitive conclusion about that.
Well, Quo is in many, many places very clear that action is not the only way in which we serve.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Right. So you're talking about it in the context of service acts from one node of the creator to another.
Yes.
Independent of the service of being that we all already offer, just by existing. Yeah. I'm reading through the archives again, and the being versus doing question just keeps coming up with Carlos Cuo over and over and over again. So I have that very much in mind. And it's important, I think, even more broadly speaking, when it comes to these decisions that events a polarity, right? That's all that they're doing. The polarity is actually an intentional, like, deep-seated philosophical bias that one is building or not building, right? If you're in the sinkhole, then you're not making a lot of progress. But as you build it's at the level of intention and kind of like a very sense of who you are that this polarity comes into reality. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay.
It's interesting that you mentioned Carlos Cuo, because there was something that came up primarily in the raw contact that both Carla and Don really, really struggled with, and that is when they were receiving this grief from the negative fifth density entity. And they took it as a given that service to others, individuals, do not judge any, including those who are dedicated to service to self. And there were several instances in which Ra expressed sympathy for that point of view, but did not encourage the naivete of it. And so there comes a point at which, when one discerns that one is dealing with a service to self energy. Now, and I'm putting it that way deliberately because one can find service to self energies within people who are not on the whole service to self, but perhaps are service to others. But when one comes face to face with a service to self energy, one must be very careful not simply to attempt to appease it, but one must be prepared to say no. One must prepare to say, this is where I must draw the line. Sorry. God bless you, but sorry. And that's a very hard choice to have to make, because it can seem negative. And it is judgmental, but where the judgment resides is the key. If you're simply judging the other person, you say, well, I think they're bad, to hell with them. That's one thing. But if the judgment is, this is the limit of how far I can go,
Mm-hmm.
that's a judgment which is centered on how one will orient one's own being in relation to this situation. And not only is one entitled to do that, but one is responsible for doing that. And so one has to be able to act to preserve one's own integrity and one's own polarity at all kinds of different levels, in the immediate interpersonal sense, and in the sense in which one conceives of how one's service fits into a broader program of action.
So this is the corollary to what we were just talking about how it's so hard to work with groups and make this calculation. Sometimes it's not a calculation you're in charge of effecting on the group, but it's a calculation you have to make within yourself to exit the group.
Yeah, that can be necessary, and it can be necessary because one encounters a limitation within oneself.
Mm-hmm.
It can be necessary because one encounters a limitation within a group of people one is proximately working with, or it can be an assessment one has to make in relation to the larger picture, which is one's best estimate of the best way one has of serving a larger population. So it becomes intricate. It becomes very difficult.
Yeah, this idea of respecting these limitations strikes me as a particularly interesting aspect of positivity. You would see the negative path more as trying to overcome, route around, disrespect any limitations that
Yeah,
confine the
yeah.
self.
And
Whereas the
this plays
positive,
out. That's right. This plays out in the higher densities as well.
Mhm.
There's warfare. Fourth density entities opposing each other, service to self on the one hand, service to other, and it's a net reduction in polarity for service to others to have to take an oppositional attitude and oppositional actions with regard to other entities within the creation. But if their ambition is to dominate you, and you know very well you cannot continue to evolve on the trajectory of service to others if you are so dominated, you have no choice. You are put in this situation where the calculus is made in the fourth density and to some extent the fifth density that they have to engage in this uh, not productive interrelation.
Yeah, this seems to be one of the things about the experience of polarity that I find most difficult, which is the acceptance of a persistent dynamic tension that is necessary to keep the poles, concentrated at each end, right? It's
Yeah,
exhausting.
it, 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 it can really offend one's sense of justice
Yes.
that one is doing one's level best to move along the path of service to others. And then you have all these wrenches thrown into the works
Mm-hmm.
by those who are doing their level best to upend that whole effort. It just seems unfair.
Yeah.
But that's what third density looks like on this planet.
Yeah, no, Hatan, actually, we had a Richmond session where Hatan addressed this directly because we had a seeker who was talking about how do I deal with the fact that it seems like negativity constantly intervenes in what I try to give to the world. And Hatan was like, don't you understand that like the very fact that they're trying to undermine you shows you what you're doing is like positive? Like
Yeah,
they're
it can
it's
show you
their
that. It can show you that, but that doesn't solve your problem
it
because
doesn't make it easier. That's true.
well,
It's not. It's. I think Hatan meant to comfort. I'm not sure if it was a comfort, but they said. But they said that your job is not to convince people to go service to others. Your job is to give them the choice for them to freely make. And you have to understand that the service to self path is doing exactly the same thing.
but at some point, you do have to stand your ground, and it can come to blows. It does.
Where does one draw upon? See that seems like such a tall order for an entity that is trying to see the self in others at the extreme levels that we are talking about. Where does one draw upon strength for that opposition when it is necessary on the positive path?
Where?
Yeah.
Uh,
How does one say
Resolve.
no with love? I guess is what I'm saying, right?
I mean, at some point, I think basically Carla had to face this. She said, "What would I be prepared to die for?" And there are some situations in which a dominating force is so close to being able to completely overrun you that's the moment when you have to take your stand. It's what tends to happen is that service to others, people are not very good at stemming the tide of aggression against them until a very late date when it becomes obvious that there's no other choice but to be resolute. And then they are, but then they find it
But then
within
they are.
themselves to be resolute.
Yeah.
And so that can happen. Now, as one gains experience and becomes less naive in dealing, which those of raw have a great deal to learn about, by the way, in dealing with a mixed environment like our third density, I think that it's possible to learn certain techniques of, laying down lines of division for others not to cross. Suggesting to them that uh, I am, after all, not a pushover, so I'm not an easy mark. And some people are better at exuding that energy than others, and that I think that's simply a process of gaining experience living in a mixed environment. But it is useful to have that.
Let me also, I agree with you that is a capability that I need to work on. I think there's another aspect that a positive entity would do well to have practiced in order to stand up in this situation, to exhibit a service to others resistance, right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about a lack of acceptance on the service to others path. And I think it's reckoning with disappointment. Because a lot of times what keeps people holding on and seeing the good in others is sometimes it's a genuine desire to see the good in others. Sometimes it's a convenient desire to see the good in others that one feels completely hoodwinked when reality finally sets in. And like our perceptions create the reality we see. So, like it's all honestly gained. But at the same time, like you're hanging on because you want to believe that somebody or something is redeemable. You see something in it that isn't wrong. There is something that is redeemable in them. There is something that is good in them. The idea is that you want to see the good in everybody. You're looking for the love in the moment on a constant basis, ideally. And there's this acceptance that's hard to do once what you see hasn't obtained by that person's choice into reality or by that organization's choice or whatever you're dealing with. And that disappointment hurts so much. But you don't want to armor your heart to avoid it. You know what I mean?
And it's a very common experience. It's almost inevitable that we'll experience disappointment. Other people continually disappoint us, and when that happens, there's always a process one has to go through. Uh, is the disappointment that I'm experiencing due largely to false expectations that I
Right.
myself might have had, or uh, were those expectations within appropriate parameters, and this other individual is just unable to uh, uh, make progress in an area that seems to me they ought to be able to make progress in. And I think the latter is by no means a rare experience. And so it can sometimes be, uh, it's always easy to solve other people's problems. Uh, it's not so easy to solve one's own. And so the uh, the impediments towards making a leap that seems obvious to one that another might be experiencing can be invisible to one. I mean, why is it you can't just take that step?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, it's interesting. I think probably the best psychologist of the problem of negativity, or of evil, if you prefer, uh, was Kierkegaard, and uh, he he defines evil as a misrelation in the self. Now he defines the self as a relation that relates itself to itself.
Mm-hmm.
So evil then is a misrelation in a relation that relates itself to itself. And in relating itself to itself, relates itself either transparently or opaquely to the power that constitutes it. That's what he thinks of as God. But uh, as uh, Kierkegaard examines the motivational dynamics of this misrelation of self to self, he he comes deeper and deeper into what he calls despair, and tries to understand why, when you can see that all you need to do is to release this potential, this self, this potential that clings to its own incapacity to release itself to the power that constitutes it, why it can't do that. And the deeper down it gets into this despair, the more impossible it is just to let go, because that's what is required. All that's required is an acceptance. But the despairing self, and the despairing self can know that and yet be no closer to being able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
All you need to do is to release your anger, your resentment, your hate. But you can't do it. And when you gaze at another person, there's no reason why they can't do it. And so you can't understand why they don't just do it.
Mm-hmm.
But they can't. It's it's a psychological impossibility. It's sometimes called a mental block. And it's one of the most uh, difficult things to deal with. It's impervious to rational explanation, but it's just not going to happen. If somebody has been traumatized and has a terrible fear of water, you're never going to teach them to swim. You know that it's something that is not going to be resolved in this incarnation.
Yeah. And that kind of stuff is to be accepted. Like that's our struggle as positive beings, is to understand that these limitations that we encounter within ourselves that cause us to say no, others encounter those too, and that causes them to say no.
The only limitation to acceptance in my psyche is self-created,
Yeah.
and
It
yet that's the biggest uh, impediment of all.
the intuition that I had when you were talking about this intractable uh 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 clinging to that which is causing despair is that it's a sense of self that is it's like the thing that you can't accept that's built into who you think you are.
That's a good point.
In other
So,
words, it has to die.
yeah, it's the ego has to undergo death,
That
the
seems to be.
ultimate sacrifice, in order for that to happen. And yet, what do I have? if I don't have everything that I think myself to be, which is what the ego likes to fashion itself in.
At least on the service to others path, we have the comfort of knowing that we are giving ourselves all the tools right now in third density to continue that exploration of what that self is uh, for a long, long time.
A long, long time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, this might be a good place to wrap things up. I think we've
Okay.
covered a lot of ground, unless
We
there was
sure
something
did.
else you want to address.
No, that's good.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about this stuff. It's been great.
Thank you, Jeremy. It was a pleasure.
Well, that's it for our interview with Dr. Tyman. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that the diminished audio wasn't a distraction. We didn't really have good mics on either side. You saw, if you were watching the video version, how I slid my mic out of the way once I realized that it wasn't actually recording anything. My laptop microphone was. But I follow in the tradition of our original co-host, Ryan Masterson, to do the best audio quality I possibly can. So in the future, we'll try to work around that and get that right. What we have coming up in a week it is the 5th channeling intensive of the Other Selves working group. And in this intensive, we're trying to get the entire working group participating either remotely or in person. And we're going to have Nithin, me, Steve, and another working group member who's going to be holding energy for us as a battery. So I'm really excited about this. If you want to participate in a small way in this intensive, we are doing our very level best to set intentions of creating a powerful calling for the Creator's love and light during the intensive that's going November 3rd through 8th of 2023. Join us in praying and saying and doing meditations to set this intention and help us create the best opportunity for this ongoing conversation with the Confederation. Your support, even if it's from afar, is very desired and appreciated. So that's what's going on, and I'm just getting ready for that. So I'm going to get back to that. We're going to try and record some stuff for the podcast while we are in country, and so look forward to that. Any questions you have, let me know. If you want dispatches from the intensive, go to the Other Selves Working Group website. That's otherselvesworking.group. On there is a form to sign up for our Substack. This is our official newsletter where we broadcast to those few parties who are interested in what we do, news updates and details like that. So I'm going to be trying to share details of how the intensive is going on there for all subscribers. So if you want to follow along, that's the place to go. So I appreciate any energy, intention, calling, love, light, whatever you can send our way so that we can do the best for the Creator. It's greatly appreciated. In the meantime, fellow other selves, stay in the love and light.